Your hair is parted with a spearpoint. You're wearing the veil of a human sacrifice victim. Your husband, who you met maybe twice before today, is about to untie a knot so complex it's named after Hercules. And the entire wedding party is standing outside your bedroom door, waiting to hear proof that your marriage has been consummated. Welcome to your wedding night in ancient Rome. Today, we're diving into 9 horrifying rituals that Roman brides endured on what should have been the happiest night of their lives. From ritualized abduction to public humiliation, from symbolic sacrifices to traditions so disturbing they make modern weddings look like a party. And here's the worst part. Many of these traditions survived for centuries. Some even influenced the wedding customs we still practice today. Let's start with something that'll make you never look at wedding photos the same way. Ritual number 1. The spear parting. Violence as beauty. On the morning of her wedding, a Roman bride's hair would be carefully styled, but not with a comb, with a spear. Specifically, a hasta calibaris, a bachelor's spear. The sharp point of this weapon would be used to part the bride's hair into 6 sections, which were then braided and coiled on top of her head in an elaborate style called the tutelus. Why a spear? The most accepted theory is that it commemorated the legendary rape of the Sabine women, when early Romans literally kidnapped women from neighboring tribes to become their wives. Using a spear symbolically linked every Roman bride to those first violently abducted women. Think about that. Your wedding hairstyle is a tribute to mass kidnapping and assault. Other scholars suggest the spear represented protection, warding off evil spirits with the weapon of Mars, god of war. But even this positive interpretation is disturbing. Your wedding day begins with a weapon touching your scalp, a reminder that marriage is about conquest, possession, and the transition from one man's control to another's. And this wasn't symbolic. Archaeological evidence and literary sources confirm this practice continued for centuries. The spear had to have drawn blood in battle. It couldn't be a ceremonial weapon. It had to be real. Roman brides literally had their hair styled with instruments of death. Ritual number 2. The veil of sacrifice, dressed like a victim. After her hair was styled with violence, the bride would don her wedding veil. But this wasn't any veil. It was a flammeum, a bright flame orange or saffron yellow veil that completely covered her face and head. The color is significant. Flammeum means flaming, and this exact same color and style of veil was worn by one other group of women, human sacrifice victims. When the Romans performed certain religious sacrifices, the victim, human or animal, was covered with a saffron veil. The bride wore the same thing. She was symbolically a sacrifice, her virginity and her former life being offered up to create a new family. But it gets darker. The veil served a practical purpose too. It made the bride anonymous. Remember, many Roman girls were married at 12 or 13 years old to men they'd never met or barely knew. These marriages were political or economic arrangements between families. The veil hid the bride's inevitable tears, her fear, her reluctance. It turned her into an object in a transaction rather than a person in a relationship. When the groom finally removed the veil later that night, he might be seeing his wife's face clearly for the first time. The tradition of the bridal veil, which survives to this day, has roots in this disturbing practice. We've sanitized its meaning, made it romantic, but originally it marked the bride as a sacrifice, hid her fear, and rendered her faceless and passive in her own wedding. Ritual number 3. The mock abduction. Ritualized kidnapping. As the wedding procession prepared to leave the bride's family home for her husband's house, a bizarre ritual occurred. The bride would cling to her mother while wedding attendants forcibly tore her away. This was scripted, expected, required. The pro-nuba, essentially the maid of honor, would physically pull the bride from her mother's arms while the bride screamed and struggled. The mother would pretend to resist, the bride would cry out. It was theater, but it was theater commemorating something real, the fact that women in Rome had no choice in their marriages. This ritual recreated the rape of the Sabine women once again, reminding everyone present that marriage was fundamentally about the transfer of a woman from one family to another against her will, or at least without requiring her consent. Now, historians debate whether this was purely symbolic by the late Republic and Empire, or whether it reflected genuine reluctance. Many Roman brides were children, 12, 13, 14 years old, being married to adult men they'd never chosen. Their tears and resistance might not have been acting. The ritual allowed the bride to demonstrate proper modesty by showing reluctance to leave her family. But it also normalized the idea that women's consent didn't matter. Whether she wanted to marry or not was irrelevant. The men had decided, and she would be taken. This custom survived in various forms for centuries. Medieval European weddings often included similar mock abductions. Even today, some cultures maintain traditions where the bride must appear reluctant or sad to leave her family, or where the groom must symbolically claim or win his bride. We've romanticized these traditions, but their roots are in the normalization of forced marriage.
Ritual number 4, the Hercules knot, humiliation by complexity. Now we arrive at the wedding night itself. The bride wore a special belt called the cingulum Herculeum, the knot of Hercules. This wasn't a simple bow. It was an elaborate, complex knot tied in a specific way that only the husband was supposed to untie. On the wedding night, with the bride lying on the marriage bed, the husband would ceremonially untie this knot before consummating the marriage. Why Hercules? Because Hercules represented strength, fertility, and protection. He had fathered 50 children in a single night, according to myth. So invoking Hercules was supposed to bless the marriage with fertility. But here's the horrifying reality. Imagine being a 12 or 13-year-old girl, lying on a bed, while a grown man you barely know struggles to untie a complex knot at your waist. You're waiting for what comes next, which you may not fully understand and definitely didn't choose. The fumbling with the knot prolongs the anxiety, the fear, the humiliation. And if the husband struggled to untie it? That was considered a very bad omen. Superstition held that difficulty with the knot meant difficulty with fertility, or that the marriage was cursed. So the pressure was on the groom to untie it successfully, which probably led to frustration, which made the bride's first sexual experience even more fraught. Some historians suggest this ritual gave the bride a moment of power. The husband had to work to consummate the marriage. But let's be honest, a symbolic knot doesn't give a child bride power over an adult man. It just adds theatrical tension to what was often a traumatic experience. The expression tying the knot comes from this tradition. We use it casually to mean getting married. But the original knot was tied by the bride and untied by the groom in a ritual that marked her loss of virginity and autonomy. Ritual number 5, the public witnessing, no privacy allowed. Here's where things get truly horrifying. The wedding party didn't leave after the ceremony. They stayed outside the bedroom door, waiting. Roman weddings included a tradition where guests would linger near the marriage chamber, singing bawdy songs, making crude jokes, and essentially waiting for confirmation that the marriage had been consummated. Why? Because consummation was what made the marriage legally binding. Without it, the marriage could be annulled. So there had to be witnesses, not to the act itself, but to the confirmation that it had occurred. In some cases, the groom would emerge from the room holding the bride's garter or showing other evidence that the marriage was complete. In earlier periods, the bloodied sheet might be displayed as proof of the bride's virginity. Imagine this from the bride's perspective. You're a child. You've just experienced your first sexual encounter with a stranger. You're in pain, probably bleeding, certainly terrified. And you know that everyone is outside the door, listening, waiting, joking about what's happening to you. This wasn't a private, intimate moment. It was a public spectacle. Your loss of virginity was community entertainment. The guests sang Fescennine verses, traditional body wedding songs that were explicitly sexual, often obscene, meant to ward off evil spirits and promote fertility through crude humor. These songs had been sung at Roman weddings for centuries, and they were vulgar enough that even Roman writers commented on their obscenity. So your wedding night soundtrack was a crowd of drunk adults singing about sex acts, making jokes about fertility, and basically ensuring you had zero privacy or dignity during what might be the most vulnerable moment of your life. Ritual number 6, the torch extinguishing, marking the transformation. Before entering the bedroom, the bride participated in another ritual, extinguishing the wedding torch. During the procession from her father's house to her husband's house, a special torch made from hawthorn wood was carried in front of the bride. This torch represented her former life, her childhood, her identity as her father's daughter. When she arrived at her new home, she would use this torch to light the hearth fire, symbolizing her new role as keeper of the household. Then the torch would be thrown into the crowd, where guests would scramble to catch it, much like a modern bouquet toss. Catching the torch was considered lucky, but here's the dark symbolism: the bride's old life, her old identity, has been extinguished. The person she was ceased to exist. She was now defined entirely by her role as wife. For Roman women, marriage meant a complete loss of identity. She took her husband's name, left her family's gods for his family's gods, abandoned her childhood home forever. The extinguishing of the torch represented the death of who she had been. And remember, she was often 12 or 13 years old. She was still a child, and her childhood was ceremonially ended in a single moment. Ritual number 7, the doorway anointing, smearing fat and blood. Before crossing the threshold of her new home, the bride had to perform a deeply strange ritual. She smeared the doorposts with wolf fat. Wolf fat. Specifically. In later periods, when wolves were less common, pig fat or olive oil might be substituted, but traditionally it was wolf fat. She would rub it on the doorframe and tie wolf fillets, strips of wool, around the doorway. The symbolism here is multi-layered and all disturbing. Wolves represented both danger and protection. The she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus was a symbol of Rome itself. But wolves were also predators, dangerous, associated with the wild. Smearing their fat on your new home's doorway was supposed to ward off evil and bring prosperity. But it also marked the threshold as a dangerous boundary, a liminal space between the outside world and the domestic sphere. Some scholars interpret this as the bride feeding the household gods, offering them fat to gain their favor. Others see it as a fertility ritual, with the fat representing abundance and plenty. But imagine the physical reality: you're standing at the door of a strange house, about to enter your new life, and you're required to smear animal fat on the walls. Your hands are greasy. The smell is pungent. It's bizarre, primitive, and deeply unsettling. And you still have to cross the threshold. Which brings us to another disturbing tradition. Ritual number 8, crossing the threshold, carried like cargo. Everyone knows the tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold. It's cute, right? Romantic? The groom sweeps his bride into his arms and carries her into their new home together. Except in ancient Rome, the groom didn't carry her. Slaves did. That's right. On your wedding night, you weren't carried by your husband. You were carried by his slaves or freedmen, the lowest members of the household staff, while your new husband watched. Why? Because if the bride tripped or stumbled crossing the threshold, it was considered a catastrophically bad omen. The marriage would be cursed. Disaster would befall the household. So to prevent this, she was carried, not by her husband, who might drop her or stumble, but by slaves whose job it was to complete the task successfully. Think about the symbolism. You're being carried like a piece of furniture, like cargo, into your new home. You have no agency. You don't walk through the door of your own free will. You're transported, passive, powerless. And your husband isn't even the one carrying you. He's standing inside, waiting. You're delivered to him by his servants. This ritual emphasized that the bride was entering the household not as an equal partner but as a new acquisition. She was property being transferred, and the slaves, other pieces of property, transported her. Ritual number 9, the morning after public confirmation. The horror didn't end with the wedding night. The morning after, there was yet another ritual. The bride had to make offerings to her new household gods, the Laras, confirming her new status. But first, the marriage had to be confirmed as complete. In some households, the matron of honor, the pranuba who had forcibly torn the bride from her mother, would enter the bedroom in the morning to check on the bride and ensure the marriage had been consummated. This wasn't a supportive check-in. This was verification. Proof had to be provided that the bride was no longer a virgin, that the marriage was legally binding, that everything had proceeded as required. The bride, who might be in pain, might be traumatized, might be bleeding, had to face this inspection with composure. She then had to dress, leave the bedroom, and perform public rituals confirming her new status as a matron, a married woman. There was no recovery time. No privacy. No moment to process what had happened. The morning after your first sexual experience as a child bride, you were expected to fulfill religious duties, host family members, and begin your life as a wife. Social historian Paul Vane wrote that the Roman wedding night took the form of a legal rape from which the woman emerged offended with her husband. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. For many Roman brides, children married to adult strangers, the wedding night was indistinguishable from assault. And yet, by morning, they were expected to smile, perform rituals, and embrace their new role. 9 rituals. 9 moments of humiliation, fear, powerlessness, and trauma disguised as tradition. Roman weddings are often romanticized. We look at beautiful art on sarcophagi showing weddings, we read poetry about love and marriage, and we think, oh, how classical, how elegant. But the reality for most Roman brides, especially young girls from elite families, was horrifying. Your hair was styled with a weapon. You were dressed like a sacrifice victim. You were ritually abducted from your mother. You wore a knot designed to emphasize your husband's struggle to access your body. Your first sexual experience happened with an audience outside the door. You were carried into your new home like an object. And the morning after, you had to prove it all happened. These weren't quaint customs. These were rituals designed to emphasize female powerlessness, to normalize child marriage, to transform girls into wives through a series of increasingly invasive and dehumanizing traditions. And here's the disturbing part, many of these traditions survived. The bridal veil, carrying the bride over the threshold, tying the knot, the wedding torch, the throwing of rice or nuts, all of these modern traditions have roots in these Roman rituals. We've sanitized them. Made them romantic. Removed the context. But the origins are dark. Now, not every Roman wedding was traumatic. Some couples genuinely loved each other. Some brides were older, more prepared, more willing. Roman marriage evolved over centuries, and by the late Empire, women had more legal rights and more say in their marriages. But for centuries, these rituals were standard, expected, required. And for the young girls who endured them, these traditions weren't romantic, they were horrifying. The next time someone talks about traditional marriage or the good old days, remember what traditional actually looked like. Remember the spear parting the hair, the veil of sacrifice, the public witnessing, the loss of identity.